The dust of her father's life clung to everything in the barn. A fine reddish powder coated the rafters and filled the air with the scent of dry earth and old memories. For 15-year-old Wren Calloway, standing alone in the vast quiet of the Kansas prairie, this barn was the last chapter of a book she never felt ready to close. Her father had been gone for 2 months now. Josiah Calloway, a man of few words and calloused hands, had been taken by the scarlet fever that swept through Sagebrush Hollow with merciless speed. Her mother Eleanor had died 3 days before him, as if her heart simply could not bear to let him go alone into whatever waited beyond. The townsfolk had offered their condolences. They brought casseroles wrapped in checkered cloth and sympathetic glances that lingered a moment too long. But soon their attention drifted back to their own struggles, their own desperate fights against the dying land, leaving Wren and her older brother Hollis in the echoing silence of the homestead. Hollis was 19 now, though the burden on his shoulders made him look older. He had inherited their father's practical nature, his steady hands, his reluctance to speak when silence would do. But where their father had possessed a quiet certainty about things unseen, Hollis trusted only what he could touch, what he could measure, what he could sell or trade or use. They had the land. They had the small house with its creaking floorboards and its memories pressed into every wall. And they had this barn, a structure that felt as immense and hollow as Wren's own heart. With them was Bandit, their father's dog. The border collie was 7 years old, his muzzle beginning to show threads of gray, his intelligent gaze holding a wisdom that sometimes made Wren feel he understood more than any human could. Since their father's death, Bandit had not left Wren's side for more than a few minutes at a time. He slept at the foot of her bed. He followed her to the well. He sat beside her when she wept into her pillow at night, his warm body a silent comfort against the cold grief that threatened to swallow her whole. Now Bandit sat near the wide barn doors, his head on his paws, watching her with those knowing eyes as she began the overwhelming task of cleaning, of sorting, of letting go. It was a duty she had postponed for weeks, but the burden of it had become unbearable. Every cobweb felt like an accusation. Every stack of old harnesses seemed to whisper of abandonment. Hollis had told her to leave it, to focus on the fields that were dying under the relentless sun, but she could not. Something pulled her here, to this barn, to the shadows where her father had spent so many solitary hours. She started with the heaviest things first, wanting the satisfaction of visible progress. A large iron-strapped feed bin sat in the corner, unused for years, its wooden sides gray with age. It was too heavy to slide, so she decided to empty it, scooping out the last of the hardened ancient grain that had fossilized into something like amberstone. As she reached the bottom, her fingers brushed against the rough wooden floorboards beneath the bin, and one of them moved. Wren froze. Her heart stuttered in her chest. The board had not simply shifted from age or rot. It had moved with a smoothness that suggested intention, a hinge, a purpose. Bandit lifted his head, a warning sound building deep in his chest. Not aggression, but alert attention. His ears pricked forward, and he rose to his feet, padding over to where Wren knelt in the dust. She pushed aside the remaining grain with trembling hands. And there it was, a small inset iron ring, almost invisible against the dark wood, worn smooth by years of secret touching. Curiosity sparked within her, a feeling she had not experienced since before the funerals. It burned away some of the gray numbness that had settled over her soul, replacing it with something almost like hope. With a grunt of effort, Wren pulled on the iron ring. The board lifted easily, revealing not the dirt foundation she expected, but a square of profound darkness, a trap door. The air that rose from the opening was different from the hot, dusty air of the barn. It was cool and still, carrying the scent of deep earth and stone. It smelled like secrets, like safety, like her father. A sturdy wooden ladder was bolted to the inside of the frame, its rungs disappearing into the blackness below. Wren could see nothing beyond the first few feet, where the light from the barn gave way to absolute shadow. Fear warred with desperate need. Her father had been a simple man, or so she had always believed. A farmer who kept no secrets she knew of. This hidden place felt like a betrayal of that simplicity. A secret life lived beneath her very feet. but it also felt like a gift, a final message from beyond the grave. Bandit nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly. His tail gave a single uncertain wag, as if giving her permission, or perhaps courage. Wren rose on shaking legs and took one of the kerosene lanterns from a hook on the wall. Her fingers trembled as she lit the wick, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows across the cavernous barn. She held it over the opening, and the light fell down into the darkness below. What she saw made her gasp. Stone walls, hand-laid stone walls, fitted together with the precision of a master craftsman. A narrow staircase, not a ladder after all, descending about 10 feet before turning a corner. This was not a hastily dug root cellar. This was a place built with purpose, with immense effort, with years of secret labor. She had to know why. Securing Bandit with a quiet command to stay, though the dog whined in protest, Wren hooked the lantern to her belt. She took a deep breath that filled her lungs with the smell of lamp oil and mystery, and she began her descent. The stone was cool to the touch beneath her palms. The silence was absolute except for the scuff of her boots on each careful step. As she rounded the corner at the bottom of the stairs, she lifted the lantern high. Its light bloomed outward, revealing a space that stole the breath from her lungs. It was not a cellar, it was a room, a large rectangular chamber, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a packed earth floor and walls reinforced with thick, expertly laid stone. The ceiling was constructed of massive oak beams, the kind that would take 2 men to lift, fitted together with wooden pegs in the old way. And it was filled. Along one wall stood dozens of sealed wooden barrels, each stenciled with a single word in her father's careful handwriting: water. She counted them quickly. 40 barrels. Each one held perhaps 50 gallons, 2,000 gallons of water, stored in the cool darkness beneath the earth. Another wall was lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, laden with preserved foods in earthenware crocks sealed with wax. She could see labels for salted meat, dried vegetables, preserved fruits, and grains of every kind. There were stacks of neatly folded woolen blankets, boxes of candles, spare lanterns, and carefully wrapped tools she did not immediately recognize. In the center of the room sat a small, efficient-looking iron stove, its pipe venting upward into a cleverly disguised flue she had never noticed from outside. Near the stove was a small wooden desk, its surface worn smooth from use, and beside it a simple chair. This was not a hideout for treasure. It was not a secret kept for shame. It was a sanctuary for survival. Wren sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Her lantern light wavered as her hands shook. In the quiet of the underground chamber, she could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and confused. What had her father been so afraid of? The question hung in the cool air, unanswered. But even as she sat there, surrounded by her father's secret life's work, Wren felt something shift inside her chest. The grief was still there, vast and heavy, but beneath it now was something else. Purpose. She had to tell Hollis. Finding her brother took longer than expected. He was in the far field, fighting a losing battle against soil that seemed to grow drier and more hostile with each passing week. The crops that should have been knee-high by now were stunted and yellow, their leaves curling inward against the relentless sun. Hollis looked up as she approached, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His expression shifted from tired frustration to concern when he saw her face. Something in her eyes must have told him this was not ordinary news. She led him back to the barn without speaking. Bandit trotted alongside them, his tail held low, his attention fixed on the trap door that now stood open like a wound in the barn's floor. Hollis stared at the opening for a long moment. His jaw tightened. Then, without a word, he descended. Wren followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She needed him to see what she had seen. She needed him to understand that their father had not been a simple man at all, that there were depths to Josiah Calloway that neither of them had ever suspected. When they stood together in the underground chamber, surrounded by barrels of water and shelves of provisions and the careful evidence of years of secret labor, Hollis was silent for a very long time. Finally he spoke. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "This is madness." Wren flinched as if he had struck her. He gestured at the barrels, at the shelves, at the stove with its clever venting system. All of this, the time it must have taken, the money. He built himself a tomb, Wren, a place to hide from something that was never going to come. It is not a tomb. Wren's voice trembled with sudden fierce conviction. She did not know where the certainty came from, but it filled her completely. It is a shelter. He built it to protect us. From what? Hollis demanded. His voice rose, echoing off the stone walls. His eyes were bright with something that looked like grief transmuted into anger. From the sun, from the dust, from the fact that we cannot pay our debts and the land is dying and our parents are dead? I do not know. Wren forced herself to remain calm, though her heart was racing. But he knew something. He built this for a reason. The reason is that he was sick. Hollis turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. Not in his body, in his mind. Grief does that to people, Wren. Fear does that. He must have started this years ago when things were good, and he just could not stop. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. We need to sell the land. Pay Jedediah Cobb what we owe. We cannot stay here chasing the delusions of a dead man. The words hit Wren like physical blows. She took a step back, her heel striking the leg of the chair beside the desk. The journals. She had not shown him the journals. Wren moved quickly, pulling open the single drawer in the desk. Inside lay 3 leather-bound books, their covers worn soft with handling. She lifted them out and held them toward her brother. He wrote everything down, she said. Instructions, explanations, everything about how to maintain this place. Hollis took the journals reluctantly. He opened the first one and began to flip through the pages, his expression unreadable. Wren watched his watchful gaze move across their father's careful handwriting, taking in the detailed schedules for rotating the water barrels, the methods for checking the seals on the food crocks, the diagrams of the ventilation system. When he reached the end of the second journal, his hand slowed, his brow furrowed. Where is the rest? He asked. Wren showed him the third journal. This one was different from the others. It was bound with a small brass lock, the kind that required a key. I cannot open it, she said. I looked for the key, but I could not find it anywhere. Hollis examined the lock, then set the journal aside with a dismissive gesture. It does not matter. The first 2 are just instructions for maintaining this place. Probably the third is more of the same, or it explains why he built it. Her brother met her eyes. In the lamplight, his face looked older than 19. There was something haunted in his gaze, something that went beyond grief. Wren, he said quietly, we cannot save this farm by living in a hole in the ground. We need to focus on the fields, on paying our debts, on surviving in the real world, not in some underground fantasy. He turned and climbed the stairs, his boots heavy on the stone. Wren heard him cross the barn floor above, heard the barn doors creak open and then close. She stood alone in the shelter, surrounded by her father's life work. And in that moment, she made a decision. Hollis could dismiss this place. He could call their father mad. He could focus on the dying fields and the mounting debts. But Wren would not abandon what Josiah Calloway had built. She would maintain it. She would care for it. She would trust that her father had known something, seen something, prepared for something that had not yet arrived. Bandit appeared at the top of the stairs, whining softly. She could see his silhouette against the barn light, patient and faithful. I am coming, she told him. She gathered the journals and tucked them under her arm, already planning her first task. The water barrels needed to be checked. The food stores needed to be inventoried. The ventilation system needed to be understood. Her father had left her this gift, this burden, this purpose. She would not let him down. Pause here for a moment. Consider what you would do in Wren's position. Your father has left you a mysterious gift, a burden that others mock and dismiss. Your brother thinks it is madness. The town is beginning to whisper. Would you trust your instincts? Would you keep faith with the dead? The news spread through Sagebrush Hollow the way all news spread in small towns. Quickly, quietly, and with generous embellishments at each telling. Within a week, everyone knew that the Calloway orphans had found something strange beneath their father's barn. Within 2 weeks, the speculation had grown wild. Some said it was a root cellar. Others claimed it was a mine shaft. though what anyone might mine in Kansas was unclear. A few whispered darker things, suggesting that Josiah Calloway had been running from the law, that the hidden chamber was proof of some criminal past. The truth, when it emerged, proved even more damaging to the siblings' reputation than any rumor. Jedediah Cobb was the first to see the shelter with his own eyes. He arrived at the Calloway homestead on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the debt that Hollis and Wren owed him. At 55, Jedediah was the closest thing Sagebrush Hollow had to a wealthy man. He owned the general store, held mortgages on half the farms in the county, and possessed a smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes. His son Corbin accompanied him. At 23, Corbin was everything his father was not. Loud where Jedediah was quiet, crude where his father was calculating, physically intimidating where Jedediah preferred to threaten through paperwork and patience. Wren was in the barn when they arrived, checking the seals on the water barrels as her father's journal instructed. She heard the horses first, then the creak of wagon wheels, then Corbin's voice calling out in that mocking tone she had come to dread. "Hey there, little orphan girl, playing in the dirt again." She emerged from the barn to find both Cobbs dismounting from their wagon. Hollis was already walking over from the house, his jaw set in the expression he wore whenever dealing with creditors. "Mr. Cobb," Hollis said evenly, "we were not expecting you." Jedediah smiled his cold smile. "Just a friendly visit, son. Wanted to see how you children were getting along, all alone out here." He glanced around the property with the assessing eye of a man calculating values. "Heard some interesting rumors in town. Something about your father leaving behind more than just this farm." Wren felt her stomach tighten. She stepped in front of the barn door, as if her small frame could somehow hide what lay beneath. But it was already too late. Corbin had seen the movement. His eyes narrowed and his grin widened. "What are you hiding in there, little mole? Something good?" Before Wren could respond, Corbin strode past her and into the barn. She followed, her heart pounding, with Hollis and Jedediah close behind. Bandit appeared from somewhere, positioning himself between Wren and the intruders, a soft, protective rumble building in his throat. Corbin stood at the open trap door, staring down into the darkness. His expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. "Pa," he called out, "you need to see this." What followed was the longest hour of Wren's life. Jedediah Cobb descended into the shelter with a lantern, moving slowly, examining everything with that calculating gaze. He read the labels on the food crocks. He counted the water barrels. He studied the ventilation system in the stove and the neatly stacked supplies. When he emerged, his expression was carefully neutral, but Wren could see something moving behind his eyes, something that looked like opportunity. "Well," he said softly, "your father was certainly a thorough man. He was preparing for something." Wren heard herself speak, though she had not intended to. He knew something was coming. Jedediah's eyebrows rose. Did he now? He exchanged a glance with his son, and something passed between them that Wren could not read. "And what might that be, child? The end of the world?" Corbin laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the barn. The old man was crazy. Everyone knew it. Just too polite to say so while he was alive. He turned to Hollis, still grinning. "Your pa spent years building himself a grave before he was even dead. How does that feel, knowing all that money went into the ground, instead of into your future?" Hollis said nothing. His hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. Jedediah stepped closer to Wren, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Now then," he said quietly, "about that debt. Your father owed me $47. You have 60 days from the date of his death to pay it. That gives you," he paused, calculating, "32 more days." "We will pay it," Hollis said flatly. "I am sure you will try." Jedediah's smile widened slightly. "But if you cannot, I want you to know that I am prepared to make you a fair offer for this land. A very fair offer, considering the circumstances." He glanced back at the trap door. "I might even throw in a little extra, given the improvements your father made." "The land is not for sale," Wren said. Both Cobbs looked at her. Corbin with contempt, Jedediah with something more complex, a mixture of amusement and calculation. Everything is for sale, child, Jedediah said softly. The only question is the price. They left soon after, their wagon raising clouds of dust as it retreated down the long dirt road toward town. Wren stood in the barn doorway, watching until they disappeared over the horizon, her hands trembling with anger and fear. Hollis came to stand beside her. They will tell everyone, he said quietly. Wren nodded. She knew it was true. By tomorrow, the whole town will know about the shelter. They will think Father was insane. They will think we are insane for keeping it. Let them think what they want. Hollis turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable. You still believe he knew something? It was not a question, but Wren answered anyway. Yes, I do. Her brother was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. I need to work the fields, he said. We have 32 days to come up with $47. If we cannot pay, we lose everything. The shelter will not matter then. Nothing will matter. He walked away, his shoulders bowed beneath the responsibility. Wren watched him go, her heart aching with a complicated mixture of love and frustration. She understood his position. She truly did. The debt was real. The dying crops were real. The hunger that waited at the edge of their lives was real. But so was the shelter. So were her father's journals. So was the feeling that had taken root in her chest, the conviction that Josiah Calloway had seen something coming. Something that would make all the mockery, all the whispered madness, all the Cobb's cruel speculation fade into insignificance. She just had to figure out what it was, and she had to maintain the shelter until it arrived. The mockery came swiftly, as Wren had known it would. Within days of Jedediah Cobb's visit, the entire town knew about the underground shelter, and the interpretation they placed upon it was exactly what she had feared. Mrs. Opal Pruitt was the first to give voice to what everyone was thinking. She stood on the steps of the church the following Sunday, her voice carrying across the gathered congregation with the practiced projection of a woman who had spent decades ensuring her opinions were heard. The Burrow children, she declared, her thin lips curling around the words. That is what they are now, those poor Calloway orphans, their parents dead, and now they are living in the dirt like prairie dogs, digging holes when they should be planting crops. Wren heard the words from where she stood at the edge of the crowd. She had come to church hoping for comfort, for community, for some reminder that not everyone in Sagebrush Hollow was cruel. But Mrs. Pruitt's voice cut through any such hope. The old woman was 58 years old, a widow whose husband had left her comfortable enough to spend her days cultivating opinions about everyone else's business. She wore black to church every Sunday, not out of mourning, but because she believed it gave her an air of authority. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, and her eyes missed nothing that might be turned into gossip. I heard the shelter is full of food, another woman murmured. Enough for years. While the rest of us struggle, Mrs. Pruitt agreed, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. While children go hungry and farms fail, Josiah Calloway was hoarding like a miser, hiding from shadows that only he could see. The words struck Wren like physical blows. She took a step back, colliding with Bandit, who had followed her to church despite her instructions to stay home. Father Gideon Marsh emerged from the church doors, his black robes flowing around his thin frame. At 50, he was a man who had grown comfortable with his authority, accustomed to being the final word on matters of morality and faith. He surveyed the gathered crowd with a frown. "What is this discussion?" he asked. Mrs. Pruitt turned to him, her expression shifting to one of concerned piety. "We were just speaking of the Calloway children, Father, and their father's unfortunate legacy." Father Marsh's gaze found Wren in the crowd. She saw something in his expression that might have been sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Judgment, perhaps, or calculation. "I have heard about the shelter," he said carefully. "It is unusual." "It is pagan," Mrs. Pruitt said firmly, "putting faith in dirt and stone instead of in the Lord. Hoarding food when we should trust in providence to provide." Several people in the crowd murmured agreement. Wren felt the pressure of their stares, their whispered condemnation pressing against her from all sides. Father Marsh raised a hand for silence. "The Calloway children have suffered a great loss," he said. "We should show them compassion, not judgment." But even as he spoke the words, Wren could see that he did not entirely believe them. There was doubt in his eyes when he looked at her. Suspicion, the same suspicion she saw everywhere now. After the service, Father Marsh caught her before she could slip away. "Child," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I would like to visit your homestead this week, to see the shelter for myself." Wren wanted to refuse, but she knew that refusing a minister's request would only fuel the rumors, would only confirm what everyone already believed. "Of course, Father," she heard herself say. "You are welcome anytime." He nodded, satisfied, and Wren walked home through the dust, Bandit at her heels, feeling the eyes of the town burning into her back. The visits began soon after. Father Marsh came first, as promised. He descended into the shelter with Wren, his black robes gathering dust from the stone walls, his expression growing more troubled with each step. "This took years to build," he said, running his hand along the carefully fitted stones. "Years of labor, years of hiding." "My father was not hiding," Wren said firmly. "Then what was he doing?" She had no answer. Not yet. The third journal remained locked, its secrets still beyond her reach. Father Marsh shook his head slowly. "Child," he said, his voice heavy with concern, "this place troubles me. It suggests a lack of faith, a belief that God will not provide, that man must save himself through works of his own hands." "He built it to protect his family," Wren insisted. "From what?" The minister's eyes met hers, and she saw genuine puzzlement there, along with something that might have been pity. "What did your father fear so greatly that he spent years of his life preparing for it? What disaster did he see coming that no one else could see?" Wren had no answer, and her silence seemed to confirm whatever conclusions Father Marsh had already drawn. Dr. Harlan Whitfield came next, summoned by concerned citizens who worried about the mental state of the orphan children. At 45, Dr. Whitfield was a practical man, educated back east before coming to Kansas to serve the scattered farms in small towns of the prairie. He had treated Wren's parents during their final illness, and she had liked him then. Now, standing in the underground chamber with his medical bag and his skeptical expression, he seemed like a stranger. "The air down here is not healthy," he pronounced after a brief examination of the space. "Lack of sunlight, potential for mold and fungal growth, stagnant atmosphere." He turned to face Wren, who had followed him down. "I recommend you seal this place up and forget about it." "The ventilation system," Wren began, but he cut her off. "A clever system, perhaps, but not sufficient for long-term habitation." His expression softened slightly. "I know you want to honor your father's memory, child, but this is not the way. This is an obsession born of grief, not a practical response to any real threat." He prescribed fresh air and hard work, the same remedy he prescribed for most ailments of the spirit. Then he climbed the ladder and left, his report already forming in his mind. Constance Bellamy, the schoolteacher, came on a Friday afternoon. At 35, she was unmarried and likely to remain so, a woman who had devoted her life to education in a place that did not always value it. She had been kind to Wren before the parents' death, encouraging her to read, to learn, to dream beyond the boundaries of the farm. Now she stood in the barn, looking down at the trap door with an expression of profound sadness. "You should come back to school," she said quietly. "You have such potential, Wren, such intelligence. Do not waste it on this." She gestured at the darkness below, unable to find the right word. "It is not a waste," Wren said. Constance sighed. "Your father was a good man. Everyone knew that. But good men can still be troubled, can still see threats where none exist." She reached out and touched Wren's shoulder gently. "You do not have to carry his burdens, child. You can put them down. You can move forward." The kindness in her voice was almost worse than Mrs. Pruitt's mockery. At least mockery could be fought against. Pity just seeped in through the cracks, weakening resolve, suggesting surrender. Wren shook her head. She could not find the words to explain what she felt. The conviction that burned in her chest, the certainty that her father had known something, seen something, prepared for something real. So she said nothing, and Constance left with the same sorrowful expression she had worn when she arrived. Corbin Cobb and his friends came last. They did not ask permission. Wren was in the shelter when she heard them above, their voices loud with drink and cruelty. Bandits' warning bark echoed down the stairs, followed by laughter and the sound of something being thrown. She climbed up to find three young men standing in the barn, passing a bottle between them. Corbin was in the center, his face flushed, his eyes bright with malicious amusement. "There she is," he announced, "the little mole coming up from her hole." "Get out," Wren said. Her voice shook slightly, but she forced herself to stand firm. "This is private property," Corbin laughed. "Private property your daddy could not afford to keep." He took a swig from the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "My pa says you have got 23 days left. Then this whole place belongs to us, including your little underground grave." One of his friends kicked dirt toward the trap door. $5 says they are both living down there before the month is out, he said, eating worms and talking to themselves. The others laughed. Bandit's hackles raised, but Wren put a hand on his collar to hold him back. "Leave," she said again. "Now." Corbin stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Or what?" he asked softly. "You gonna sick your dog on me? Cry to the sheriff?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "No one is coming to save you, little mole. No one cares. Your parents are dead, your brother is useless, and everyone in town knows your whole family was crazy." He straightened up and turned to his friends, grinning. "Come on. Nothing here worth stealing anyway." They left laughing, their voices fading into the distance. Wren stood in the barn doorway, watching them go, her body shaking with anger and fear, and a helplessness that threatened to overwhelm her. 23 days. That was all the time she had left. All the time to prove that her father had not been mad, that his life's work had meaning, that the shelter beneath the barn was not a tomb, but a gift. 23 days. And she still had not found the key to the third journal. Tobias Harding arrived on a morning so still that the dust seemed to hang suspended in the air, each particle motionless, waiting. Wren was in the shelter when she heard his voice calling down from above. She had been there since before dawn, following her father's instructions for checking the seals on the food crocks, her hands raw and blistered from the work, but her spirit strangely at peace. She climbed the stairs to find an old man standing in the barn, his weathered face turned toward the trap door with an expression of profound recognition. At 62, Tobias Harding was the closest thing Sagebrush Hollow had to a master craftsman. His carpentry was sought by anyone who could afford it, and his reputation for quality extended across 3 counties. He was also the quietest man in town, so silent that most people forgot he existed between their rare encounters with him. Now he stood in the Callaway barn, and for the first time in Wren's memory, there were words forming behind his careful eyes. "I knew your father," he said simply, "before you were born, before your mother even. He was a young man then, just arrived from the West, had nothing but the clothes on his back and a look in his eyes like he had seen things no one should see." Wren felt her breath catch. "You knew him?" Tobias nodded slowly. "Helped him build this barn, matter of fact. Helped him with other things, too. The shelter." The old carpenter's silence was answer enough. "Why did he build it?" Wren asked, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "Everyone says he was mad. Everyone says he was afraid of nothing. But you knew him. You helped him. You must know why." Tobias was quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the trap door, to the darkness below, to the secrets he had helped create. "He never told me everything," he said finally. "But I know he came from the western part of the territory, from a place that does not exist anymore, a place that got erased." "Erased?" The old man's eyes met hers. There was something ancient in his gaze, something that had witnessed more than he would ever speak aloud. "Your father was a survivor," he said. "That is all I know for certain. Whatever he survived, it convinced him that the world could end without warning, that the sky itself could become an enemy, that the only safety was in the earth." He turned and walked toward the barn doors, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. "If Josiah Calloway built that shelter," he said quietly, "then he had a reason. He was not a man who wasted effort on fantasies." He was silent for a moment, then added, "The sky has been changing color these past few days. Yellow in the mornings, gray in the afternoons. My bones have been aching the way they did once before, a long time ago. When? Wren asked. When did they ache like that before? Tobias Harding looked out at the horizon, where something that might have been clouds or might have been something else was building in the west. 1895, he said, the year the world ended. Then he was gone, leaving Wren with more questions than answers and a growing certainty that time was running out. 3 days after Tobias Harding's visit, a stranger appeared at the edge of the Calloway property. Wren saw him first from the barn door, a lean figure walking up the dusty road with nothing but a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with the careful pace of someone who had walked a long way and expected to walk further still. Bandit raised his head and watched but did not bark. That was unusual. The dog had grown suspicious of visitors since the cob's mocking visits. The stranger stopped at the fence line, as if waiting for permission to enter. He was young, Wren realized as she walked closer. Perhaps 17, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that held a wariness she recognized. The wariness of someone who had learned early that the world could be cruel. "I am looking for work," he said. His voice was quiet, respectful. "I heard you might need help." "Who told you that?" "Man in town. Old carpenter." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "He said you were doing important work out here. Said you might need hands that were willing to learn." "Tobias Harding?" "It had to be." "What is your name?" "Shepard Garrett." He shifted his bag on his shoulder. "I have no family, no home to speak of, but I work hard and I learn fast." Wren studied him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of her own reflection in the mirror. The look of someone carrying a burden that others could not see. "Come with me," she said. She led him to the barn, to the trap door, down into the shelter. She watched his face as the lamplight revealed her father's life work. Watched for the mockery, the disbelief, the dismissal she had seen in so many other faces. It never came. Instead, Shepard Garrett walked slowly around the chamber, examining the water barrels, the food stores, the ventilation system. His fingers traced the careful stonework of the walls. His eyes took in every detail with an intensity that spoke of genuine interest. "How does the air stay fresh?" he asked finally. Wren blinked. It was the first time anyone had asked that question without skepticism in their voice. "The ventilation system," she said, pointing to the pipes her father had installed. "There is an intake hidden in a rock formation 100 yards from the barn. The air flows through naturally because of the temperature difference between above and below ground." Shepard nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "And the water? How do you keep it from going stale?" "Rotation. We empty and refill the barrels on a schedule." My father wrote it all down. Every system, every maintenance task, every detail. The young man was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to face her. "People in town say your father was mad," he said. His voice was gentle but direct. "They say you and your brother are mad too, that you are wasting your time on foolishness." Wren felt her shoulders tense. "Is that what you think?" Shepard shook his head slowly. "I think your father knew something they do not know. I think he saw something they have not seen. And I think whatever is coming," he raised his eyes to the ceiling, to the world above. "This place will be the difference between living and dying." "Why do you think that?" "Because I have seen what the sky can do." Shepard's voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper. 3 years ago, I was in Oklahoma, working a farm near Boise City. A dust storm came through that buried the house to the roof line. The family I worked for, the Hendersons, all 5 of them died. I survived because I found an old well and climbed down into it. He met Wren's eyes, and she saw the same haunted recognition that must have been in her father's eyes all those years ago. "I have been looking for a place like this ever since," he said. "A place built by someone who understands. Someone who knows what the earth can give us when the sky turns against us." Wren felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the loneliness she had carried since her parents' death. "Stay," she said. "Help us, and I will teach you everything my father taught me." Shepard Garrett smiled for the first time since his arrival. It transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter, more like the boy he still was beneath his experiences. "That is all I have ever wanted," he said. to learn, to prepare, to never be caught helpless again. He stayed, and in the days that followed, he proved himself invaluable. The days that followed were a blur of labor and hope renewed. With Shepard's help, the work that had seemed endless suddenly became manageable. He was strong, willing, and quick to learn. Within a week, he understood the shelter systems almost as well as Wren did. Within 2 weeks, he was suggesting improvements that even Josiah Calloway had not considered. Hollis watched from a distance at first, suspicious of the stranger who had appeared so conveniently. But Shepard's quiet dedication won him over gradually. The young man never complained, never asked for more than food and a place to sleep in the barn, never gave any indication that he expected anything in return for his labor. One evening, as the three of them shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Hollis finally asked the question that had been forming in his mind. "Why are you really here?" Shepard set down his fork and met Hollis's gaze directly. He seemed to understand that this was a test, that his answer would determine whether he was truly welcome. "Because I am tired of running," he said simply. "Tired of looking for something I could not find." He gestured around them, at the small house, at the barn visible through the window, at the land that stretched away toward the horizon. "Your father built something real here, something that matters. I want to be part of that. I want to help you keep it." Hollis was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once and returned to his meal. It was not much, but for Hollis, it was acceptance. That night, something shifted between the three of them. They became not just co-workers, but allies, partners in a cause that none of them fully understood, but all of them believed in. And Wren finally found the courage to continue her search for the key. It came to her 3 days later, in a moment of quiet desperation. She was brushing burrs from Bandit's fur, a nightly ritual that had become almost meditative in its repetition. The dog lay still beneath her hands, patient and trusting, his tail giving an occasional lazy wag. Her fingers caught on something beneath his collar, something small and hard and metallic. Wren's breath stopped. She unfastened the collar with trembling fingers and turned it over. There, sewn into the leather with tiny, precise stitches, was a small brass key. Her father had entrusted his final secret to the family dog, to the one creature who would never leave his daughter's side. That night, by the light of a single candle in the underground shelter, Wren opened the third journal. What she found inside changed everything. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1895. "I am 8 years old. The sky turned black at 3 in the afternoon. Not dark, not stormy, black. Like the end of everything." Her father's handwriting was different here. Younger, shakier. The words of a child trying to make sense of the impossible. "Mama pushed me into the root cellar. She said, 'Stay here, Josiah. Do not come out until I come to get you.' Then she closed the door. I heard her coughing. Then I heard Papa calling for her. Then I heard screaming. Then I did not hear anything at all. When I came out 3 days later, the house was gone. Mama was gone. Papa was gone. My sister Ruth was gone. They found her body 20 yards from where the house had been. She was 5 years old. The ground was covered in black dust, 4 feet deep in some places. The whole settlement was gone. 47 people, only 3 survived. I was one of them. I survived because Mama put me in the earth. I will never forget. I will never be unprepared. I will build a shelter so deep that nothing can touch the people I love. I will remember for them, so they will never have to know what I know. So they will never have to see what I saw. This is my promise. This is my purpose. This is my gift to the future." Wren read through the night, her candle burning lower and lower as page after page revealed her father's secret history. His journey from orphan survivor to determined builder. His years of research into storms and weather patterns. His discovery that the Great Dust Storm of 1895 was not unique, that similar catastrophes had occurred throughout history, that they would occur again. And his growing certainty in the final entries that another storm was coming. "The signs are there," he wrote in an entry dated just 2 weeks before his death. "The same signs I remember from my childhood. The yellow sky, the stillness in the air, the strange behavior of animals, the pressure in my chest that has not left for months. I may not live to see it. The fever is in me now. I can feel it burning through my body. But the shelter is ready. The journals are complete. My children will survive what is coming. They will survive because I remembered, because I never stopped preparing, because love is not just a feeling. Love is action. Love is building something that will outlast your own breath. Wren closed the journal as the candle guttered and died. She sat in the darkness of the shelter, surrounded by her father's life work, and for the first time since his death, she did not feel alone. She felt watched over, protected, loved. And she knew with absolute certainty that he had been right. The storm was coming. The next morning, Wren went to visit old Mabel Thornton. The widow lived on the far edge of town, in a small cabin that seemed to be slowly returning to the earth. At 78, she was the oldest person in Sagebrush Hollow, and therefore the most ignored. Her opinions were considered outdated. Her memories were dismissed as exaggerations. Her warnings were laughed off as the fears of a mind too ancient to trust. But Tobias Harding had mentioned 1895, and Mabel Thornton had been alive in 1895. The old woman opened her door before Wren could knock, as if she had been expecting the visit. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, but something sharp and intelligent moved behind them. "You are Josiah's girl," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Mabel studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and gestured for Wren to enter. The cabin's interior was dim and cluttered, filled with the accumulated belongings of nearly 8 decades of life. But it was warm, and it smelled of herbs and wood smoke, and there was something comforting about its chaos. "You came about the shelter," Mabel said, lowering herself into a rocking chair with the careful movements of the very old. "You want to know why he built it." Wren nodded. She remained standing, her hat in her hands, suddenly unsure how to ask the questions burning in her chest. Mabel began to rock, the chair creaking rhythmically against the wooden floor. "Your father came to see me," she said, 20 years ago now, maybe more. He wanted to know about the storm." "What storm?" The old woman's eyes fixed on something Wren could not see, something in the past perhaps, or something in the future. 1895, she said. "I was 29 years old. Had a husband named Thomas, had 2 children, a boy named Samuel, he was 7, a girl named Ruth, she was 4. Wren noticed the past tense. Had, was. "It came in the afternoon," Mabel continued. Her voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were narrating someone else's memory. "The sky turned black. Not dark, not stormy. Black. Like someone had hung a curtain across the sun. And the sound..." She shuddered, like every train in the world coming at once. "A dust storm," Wren said. Mabel shook her head slowly. "No. Dust storms, I knew. Had lived through plenty. This was different. This was the earth itself rising up, the ground becoming sky, the world turning inside out." She was silent for a moment, lost in the terrible memory. "Thomas went out to bring in the animals. He never came back. I found him 2 days later, 20 feet from the door. He had gotten lost in 20 feet and frozen to death, even though it was April." Wren felt her throat tighten. "The children," Mabel continued, her voice barely a whisper now. "I put them in the root cellar, told them to stay there until Mama came to get them. But the cellar was not deep enough. The dust got in. The dust got in everywhere." She stopped rocking. Her milky eyes glistened with tears that she seemed too tired to shed. "When it was over, 3 days later, my Samuel was dead. My Ruth was so sick she died a week after. I survived because I had wrapped myself in wet cloth and breathed through a rag. They had not understood to do that. They were too young. They were too young, and I was not there, and they died alone in the dark." Wren could not speak. The gravity of the old woman's grief pressed against her chest like a physical force. "Your father," Mabel said suddenly, her voice sharpening. "He came to me because he had heard about the storm. He had heard that I survived. He wanted to know how, why, what I would do differently if I had the chance." "What did you tell him?" "Go deep." Mabel's eyes found Wren's, and there was fire in them now. Fire that 80 years had not extinguished. "Go deep and stay there until the world decides to be the world again. Do not trust the sky. Do not trust the air. Do not trust anything except the earth beneath your feet. She leaned forward in her chair. Your father understood. He understood because he had seen it too. He was just a boy then, 8 years old, living in a settlement west of here. A settlement that does not exist anymore because the storm took it. Took everything. His parents, his sister, his entire world. Wren felt the blood drain from her face. My father never told me. He never told anyone. Mabel settled back in her chair, the fire fading from her eyes, replaced by exhaustion. Some wounds are too deep for words. They can only be spoken through action, through preparation, through building a shelter that might save the people you love when the sky decides to become your enemy again. The old woman closed her eyes. It is coming back, she said softly. I can feel it in my bones. The same pressure, the same taste in the air, the same wrongness in the light. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Wren. Your father felt it too. That is why he built what he built. Not because he was mad, because he remembered. Pause here for a moment. The signs are gathering. The sky is changing. The old woman who survived remembers. The carpenter who helped your father warns. Would you trust these voices? Or would you dismiss them as the fears of the elderly, the superstitions of the past? Wren walked home in a daze, Mabel's words echoing in her mind. The sky above her was that same wrong color. Yellow-gray, heavy, waiting. She found Hollis in the barn staring down at the open trap door. He turned when he heard her approach. His expression was different now. The certainty that had defined him for weeks had cracked, and through the cracks she could see something that looked almost like fear. Tobias Harding came by while you were gone, he said quietly. He told me things. About father. About what happened to him when he was a boy. Wren nodded. She had no words left. The heaviness of her father's secret, the tragedy that had shaped his entire life, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The sky is wrong, Hollis continued. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. The animals are acting strange. The birds left 3 weeks early. Even the bugs are hiding. He looked at her, and for the first time since their parents' death, she saw her brother. Not the practical man who dealt with creditors and worried about crops. Not the skeptic who dismissed their father's work as madness. Just Hollis. Just her brother. Just a 19-year-old boy who was scared and trying not to show it. I do not understand why father built the shelter, he said. I still do not. But I am starting to think. He swallowed hard. I am starting to think he might have had a reason. Wren crossed the space between them and took his hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, his skin dry and cracked from work in the dying fields. Will you help me? She asked quietly. Will you help me finish what he started? Hollis looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. Yes, he said. I will help. The days that followed were different. Hollis threw himself into the work of maintaining the shelter with the same intensity he had previously reserved for the failing crops. He checked the water barrels, reinforced the shelving, tested the ventilation system until he understood every component. Shepard worked alongside them, his quiet dedication never wavering. The three of them fell into a rhythm, a partnership born of shared purpose and growing trust. And still the townspeople mocked them. The Burrow children, Mrs. Pruitt continued to call them, her voice carrying across the general store, across the church steps, across every gathering where gossip flowed like water. Still digging in the dirt while the rest of us work for a living. Corbin Cobb and his friends rode past the homestead several times, shouting insults that Wren tried not to hear. Once they threw stones at the barn, their laughter echoing across the empty fields. Jedediah Cobb himself came to remind them of the debt. 18 days now, he said, his cold eyes taking in the sight of all three young people covered in dust from their underground work. Then this land is mine, unless, of course, you have reconsidered my offer. The land is not for sale, Hollis said flatly. Jedediah smiled his thin smile. We shall see. But beneath the mockery and the threats, something else was happening. The sky continued to change. Day by day, the yellow-gray haze thickened. The air grew heavier, charged with something that made Wren's skin prickle and her heart race. The horizon to the west seemed to pulse with a strange, dark energy that defied explanation. The animals knew. Bandits spent hours staring at that horizon, a constant soft whine in his throat. The livestock in neighboring farms grew restless, refusing to graze, clustering together in tight, nervous groups. And the wind died. For 3 days the air was absolutely still, not a breath of movement, not a whisper of breeze. The dust that should have blown across the fields simply hung, suspended, motionless, as if the world itself was holding its breath. On the 10th day before the debt came due, Wren woke before dawn to a silence so complete it hurt her ears. She walked outside to find the sky the color of a bruise, purple and yellow and gray, swirling together in patterns that made no natural sense. The sun hung behind it all, a pale disk that cast no warmth, no comfort, no light that felt like light. Hollis stood on the porch, his face pale. "It is today," he said quietly. He did not turn to look at her. His eyes remained fixed on that terrible sky. Whatever Father was preparing for. "It is today." Wren nodded. She had known it the moment she woke, had felt it in her bones, just as old Mabel Thornton had described. The same pressure, the same wrongness, the same certainty that the world was about to change. "We should go to the shelter," she said. "Not yet." Hollis finally turned to face her. His expression was calm, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been fear or might have been resolution. "We need to warn the town first. They will not believe us, I know. But we have to try." They rode into Sagebrush Hollow together, Shepherd following on the old mule, pushing their horses as fast as they would go. The town was just beginning to stir when they arrived, shopkeepers opening their doors, farmers loading wagons, children making their way to school. No one seemed to notice the sky. Hollis dismounted in front of the general store and raised his voice loud enough to carry across the main street. "Listen to me. Everyone, listen. A storm is coming. A bad one. Worse than anything you have seen before. You need to get to shelter. Underground if you can. Cellars, root houses, anywhere below the earth." People stopped what they were doing. They stared. A few laughed. Jedediah Cobb emerged from his store, his expression amused. "Well, well," he said, "the burro boy has finally learned to speak." He gestured at the sky. "Let me guess. You think those clouds are dangerous?" "Look at them," Hollis insisted. "Look at the color. Look at how still the air is. This is not natural. This is what our father warned us about." "Your father was insane," Corbin Cobb called out from the saloon across the street. His friends laughed. "And apparently it runs in the family." Mrs. Pruitt appeared on the church steps, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. "Young man," she said coldly, "you are making a spectacle of yourself. Your parents would be ashamed." Wren stepped forward. She was shaking, but her voice was steady. "Our father survived a storm like this when he was 8 years old," she said. "His whole family died. His whole settlement was destroyed. He spent his entire life preparing for another one. And it is here. It is coming today." Silence fell over the crowd. But it was not the silence of belief. It was the silence of embarrassment, of pity, of dismissal. Father Gideon Marsh emerged from the church, his black robes flowing around him. "My children," he said gently, "I understand that you are grieving, that you miss your parents. But spreading fear is not the answer. God will protect us, as he always has." "God did not protect our father's family in 1895, Wren said. "Earth protected him, the earth our father taught us to trust." The minister's expression hardened. "That is enough," he said. "Go home, both of you, tend to your affairs, and pray for the strength to accept that some things are beyond our control." Hollis and Wren stood in the middle of the street as the crowd dispersed. The shopkeepers returned to their shops. The farmers continued loading their wagons. The children made their way to school. No one believed them. No one was prepared. They rode home in silence, the terrible sky growing darker with each passing minute. Shepherd met them at the gate, his face pale with understanding. "It is time," he said simply. By the time they reached the homestead, the horizon to the west had changed. It was no longer yellow. It was black. A wall of black that stretched from earth to sky, moving toward them with impossible speed. It looked like a mountain range that had come to life. It looked like the edge of the world. It looked like death. "Now," Wren whispered. They ran for the barn. Bandit was already there. barking frantically, his eyes wild with an animal terror that needed no explanation. Hollis threw open the trap door. Wren grabbed the lanterns, the emergency supplies, the things they had prepared for this moment. They descended together, Shepherd close behind, the dog between them, the darkness of the shelter rising up to embrace them. Hollis pulled the trap door shut just as the first gust of wind hit the barn. The sound was like nothing Wren had ever heard, a roar so deep and so vast that it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground shook, the walls of the shelter trembled. Dust sifted down from the ceiling despite the careful construction, despite the years of preparation. But the shelter held. In the sudden silence that followed the closing of the door, Wren could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Hollis's ragged breathing beside her, could hear Bandit whimpering softly as he pressed against her legs. And from above, muffled but unmistakable, she could hear the world ending. For 6 hours they listened to the storm. The roar never stopped. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes so loud that Wren had to cover her ears, sometimes dropping to a rumble that she felt more than heard. Through it all, the shelter remained intact. The air stayed clean. The temperature held steady at 55 degrees. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They simply sat together in the lamplight, waiting for the world above to decide whether it would survive. Bandit lay with his head on Wren's lap, his watchful gaze tracking every shadow, every movement of dust, every flicker of the flame. He had stopped whimpering. Now he was simply alert, ready to defend his people against whatever came. At some point, Hollis reached over and took Wren's hand. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have believed you sooner. I should have believed Father." Wren squeezed his hand in response. She could not speak. The pressure of everything that had happened, everything that was happening, pressed against her chest and stole her words. Then through the roar of the storm, she heard something else, a pounding, rhythmic, desperate. Someone was at the barn door above. Hollis was on his feet instantly, moving toward the stairs. Wren caught his arm. "Wait," she said. "It could be dangerous. They are dying up there." Her brother's voice was steady. "Whoever they are, whatever they said about us, they are dying." He pulled free and climbed the stairs. Wren followed, her heart pounding, Bandit at her heels. Shepherd remained below, ready to help whoever came. When they opened the trap door, the barn was full of choking black dust. The air was barely breathable, but they could still hear the pounding, louder now, more desperate. Hollis fought his way to the barn doors. The wind screamed through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it a darkness so complete that the lantern he held seemed to be swallowed by it. He threw the bar and pulled the door open. A wall of bodies fell through. They came in pairs and groups, stumbling, choking, blinded by the dust that coated their faces and filled their lungs. Some of them carried children. Some of them were dragged by others. All of them were dying, and Wren recognized every face. Jedediah Cobb, his fine clothes ruined, his cold eyes wild with terror. Mrs. Opal Pruitt, her gray hair loose and tangled, her mouth opening and closing as she gasped for air. Corbin Cobb, supported by 2 of his friends, all of them barely able to stand. Father Gideon Marsh, his black robes torn, his face a mask of dust and desperation. Dr. Harlan Whitfield carrying a child in his arms, his medical bag lost somewhere in the storm. Constance Bellamy, her eyes streaming, her voice hoarse from coughing, and others, so many others. Families from town, farmers from the surrounding countryside, people who had nowhere else to go. 27 people in all. 9 of them children. They had come to the place they mocked. They had come to the Burrow children for salvation. Consider this moment. The people who laughed at you, who called you names, who questioned your sanity and your worth. Now they stand before you, helpless, begging for the mercy they never showed. What would you do? Wren did not hesitate. "This way," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone follow me. Single file. Watch your step on the stairs." She led them down into the shelter, one by one, as Hollis worked to close the barn doors against the howling storm. Shepherd stood at the bottom of the stairs, helping each person to safety, his calm presence a steadying force in the midst of panic. The descent was slow and careful, the stairs too narrow for speed, the people too weak for anything but the most basic movements. But they made it. All of them. All 27 survivors plus Wren and Hollis and Shepherd and Bandit. 30 souls in a shelter built for 20. Wren moved through the crowd, distributing blankets, offering water from the precious supply her father had stored. Hollis helped those who were too weak to stand, finding them places to sit, checking their wounds, wiping the dust from the eyes of crying children. Shepherd proved invaluable, his experience with survival guiding his every action. He checked the ventilation system, ensured the air was flowing properly, organized the distribution of supplies with quiet efficiency. No one spoke at first. The roar of the storm above was too loud, and the shock of survival too fresh for words. But Wren could feel their eyes on her, could feel the heaviness of their stares, their disbelief, their dawning understanding of what had happened, of what they had dismissed, of who had saved them. It was Mrs. Opal Pruitt who broke the silence. She was sitting against the far wall, her ruined dress spread around her, her face still streaked with dust and tears. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "The Burrow children," she said. Her eyes met Wren's across the crowded shelter. "We called you that. We laughed at you." Wren said nothing. There was nothing to say. Mrs. Pruitt looked around the shelter, taking in the careful construction, the organized supplies, the ventilation system that was even now keeping them all alive. She looked at the water barrels, the food stores, the evidence of years of preparation. "Your father built this," she said. "He built it for us." "He built it for whoever needed it," Wren replied quietly. Mrs. Pruitt's face crumpled. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." The words broke something loose in the shelter. Other voices joined hers. Jedediah Cobb, his voice rough with dust and emotion, apologizing for the debt, for the threats, for the mockery. Father Marsh, his eyes downcast, confessing that he had judged without understanding. Dr. Whitfield admitting that he had been wrong about the air, about the purpose, about everything. Even Corbin Cobb, who had thrown stones and called them names, who had laughed loudest and longest at the Burrow children, found words. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "About everything. I was so wrong." Wren accepted their apologies one by one. Not because she had forgiven them, not yet, but because forgiveness could wait. Survival could not. The storm raged on. For 2 days and 2 nights the world above ceased to exist. The roar never completely stopped, though it rose and fell in waves that seemed to follow no pattern. Sometimes dust sifted down through cracks they had not known existed, coating everyone in a fine layer of black grit. Sometimes the temperature fluctuated, and they huddled together for warmth. Sometimes a child would cry, and someone would comfort them, passing compassion from stranger to stranger like a candle flame in darkness. But they survived, all of them. In the quiet moments when the storm's voice dropped to a murmur, people talked. They shared stories of how they had been caught by the storm, how they had heard about the Callaway shelter, how they had fought their way through the impossible darkness to reach it. Tobias Harding had spread the word. The old carpenter had gone door to door, shouting over the wind, leading people toward the one place he knew could save them. He had saved a dozen lives before the storm grew too strong, before he was forced to seek shelter himself in his own root cellar. Old Mabel Thornton had not come. She had told people she was too old to make the journey, that she had survived one storm and was ready to meet whatever came. But she had pointed others toward the Callaway barn, had given them directions, had insisted they go while they still could. Not everyone had listened. Not everyone had made it. But 27 people had reached the shelter. 27 people were alive because of a man who had been called mad, whose children had been mocked as Burrow children, whose life's work had been dismissed as the product of grief and delusion. On the second night, when the storm seemed to be weakening at last, Wren opened her father's third journal. She read aloud, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. October 15th, 1895. I am 8 years old. The shelter fell silent. Every face turned toward her, every ear strained to hear. The sky turned black at 3 in the afternoon. Mama pushed me into the root cellar. She said, "Stay here, Josiah. Do not come out until I come to get you." She read them the whole story, Her father's survival, his loss, his decades of preparation, his certainty that another storm would come, and his determination to save the people he loved when it did. When she reached the final entry, written just 2 weeks before his death, her voice broke. I may not live to see it, but the shelter is ready. My children will survive what is coming. They will survive because I remembered, because I never stopped preparing, because love is not just a feeling, love is action. Love is building something that will outlast your own breath. Silence filled the shelter, a silence deeper than any storm. Then Father Gideon Marsh spoke. We called him mad, he said softly. We called him a fool, a hoarder, a man afraid of shadows. His voice caught. We were the fools. All of us. Mrs. Pruitt was weeping openly now. He knew, she said. He knew this was coming. He tried to protect us all, and we laughed at him. Not all of you, Wren said. She thought of Tobias Harding, who had helped her father build the shelter, of old Mabel Thornton, who had validated his fears, of Shepherd Garrett, who had come seeking exactly what her father had built. Some of you listened, some of you believed, but most of us did not, Jedediah Cobb said. His voice was heavy with shame. Most of us dismissed him, dismissed you, and now? He gestured at the shelter around them, at the evidence of years of preparation that had saved all their lives. Now we owe you everything. You do not owe us anything, Hollis said. His voice was quiet but firm. This is what our father wanted. This is why he built it. Not for revenge, not for vindication, for this, for you, for everyone. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. Wren knew it was over before she opened the trap door. The silence above had changed. It was no longer the silence of violence barely contained. It was the silence of exhaustion, of endings, of a world that had survived something terrible and was now catching its breath. She climbed the stairs alone, leaving the others below. Hollis wanted to come, but she shook her head. This was something she needed to see by herself. The barn had survived, though barely. The doors hung at angles, their hinges twisted by wind. The walls were sand-blasted smooth, their paint scoured away, their wood exposed and weathered, as if the building had aged decades overnight. She pushed through the damaged doors and stepped outside. The world was gray. Everything, everywhere, was covered in a thick blanket of fine black dust. It smoothed the landscape into soft, mournful dunes, erasing the boundaries between field and road, between earth and sky. The sun hung pale and distant behind a haze that seemed to stretch forever. Their house was still standing, though buried to the windowsills. The barn was intact. The well was covered but findable. They had survived. And then the others began to emerge. One by one, they climbed the stairs and stepped out into the changed world. Parents carrying children, neighbors who had barely spoken before the storm, enemies who had found something like forgiveness in the darkness below. They stood together in the silence, looking at what remained of their town, their farms, their lives. And then Jedediah Cobb did something unexpected. He walked to where Wren stood, her dress still coated with dust, her hair tangled, her eyes red from tears and exhaustion. He stood before her for a long moment, his cold businessman's eyes showing something she had never seen there before. Regret. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Wren recognized it immediately. The debt. The $47 that would have cost them their home. Jedediah Cobb tore it in half, then in quarters, then into pieces so small they scattered on the wind like snow. Your father saved us, he said, his voice rough. Your father, who we called mad. Your father, who we dismissed and mocked and ignored. He built something that saved every person standing here. He looked at the others, at the witnesses to this moment. This land belongs to you, forever. I will ensure that no one ever questions that again. Wren could not speak. The pressure of the moment, of everything that had happened, pressed against her chest and stole her breath. But she nodded, and that was enough. From burrow children to the saviors of an entire town, from mockery to gratitude, from isolation to community. This is the power of preparation. This is the vindication of those who see what others refuse to see. Remember this moment when you doubt yourself. Remember this moment when others laugh at your caution. The rebuilding began that very day. No one suggested that the Calloway children should work alone. No one whispered about the Burrow children or the madness of their father. Instead, the entire town came together, joined by survivors from neighboring farms, to dig out and restore what the storm had tried to destroy. Hollis led the effort at their own homestead, organizing teams of volunteers, directing the work with the same practical efficiency he had once devoted to failing crops. Wren worked beside him, her father's journals in hand, sharing the knowledge that Josiah Calloway had spent a lifetime accumulating. Shepard proved invaluable, his calm competence and willingness to work winning him respect throughout the community. He never sought recognition, never reminded anyone of the mockery they had directed at the Calloways. He simply worked, quietly and tirelessly, as if he had always belonged. The third journal became a kind of scripture. People borrowed it, copied it, studied its instructions for reading the sky and preparing for disaster. What had once been dismissed as the ravings of a madman was now treasured as the wisdom of a prophet. By the end of that first summer, 12 families had begun construction on their own underground shelters, following the designs in Josiah Calloway's journals. By the following spring, the number had doubled. Tobias Harding came on the second day of rebuilding, his own property damaged, but his spirit intact. "Your father would be proud," he told Wren. He stood at the edge of the trapdoor, looking down into the shelter that had saved so many lives. He built this place to prove that preparation matters, that the old knowledge, the knowledge that comes from surviving, should never be forgotten. Wren nodded. She was too tired for words, but the old carpenter understood. "I will help you teach others," he said, "the way your father taught me, the way the knowledge has always been passed, from one generation to the next." Old Mabel Thornton survived the storm in her own root cellar, wrapped in wet cloth as she had been 40 years before. She came to visit a week later, her ancient eyes bright with vindication. "I told them," she said, settling into a chair that Hollis had salvaged from the dust. "I told them all that it would come back, that the sky would turn against us again. But no one listens to old women. No one listens until it is too late." Wren knelt beside her, taking her weathered hands. "You listened," she said. "You told my father what to prepare for. You helped save everyone." Mabel smiled, an expression that transformed her lined face into something almost young. "Your father saved everyone," she said. "I just remembered. He built." The months passed. Spring turned to summer, and the dust slowly settled, absorbed back into the earth that had given it birth. The fields, poisoned by the storm, had to be replanted. The livestock, lost or scattered, had to be replaced. The buildings, damaged and buried, had to be rebuilt. But the community that emerged from the disaster was stronger than the one that had existed before. People worked together now in ways they never had. They shared resources. They helped each other. They remembered the darkness of the shelter, the close quarters where former enemies had become allies, and they carried that memory forward. Jedediah Cobb became something unexpected, an advocate. He used his influence and his money to help families rebuild, asking nothing in return. He spoke publicly about his shame, about the way he had treated the Calloways, about the lesson he had learned in the darkness below the earth. "We thought we knew better," he said at a town meeting that summer. "We thought our experience, our wisdom, our comfortable lives had taught us everything we needed to know." He paused, his cold eyes warming with something that might have been humility. "We were wrong, and if not for a man we called mad, we would all be dead." Mrs. Opal Pruitt stopped spreading gossip. Instead, she became the unofficial historian of the storm, collecting accounts from survivors, preserving the stories for future generations. "The Burrow children," she admitted to Wren one day, "was the cruelest thing I ever said, and I said many cruel things in my life." Father Gideon Marsh delivered a sermon about faith and works, about the wisdom that comes from suffering, about the duty of the community to protect its most vulnerable members. He never again suggested that preparation was a lack of faith. He never again dismissed what he did not understand. Dr. Whitfield became fascinated by the science of survival. He studied Josiah Calloway's journals with the intensity of a scholar, understanding for the first time the principles that had kept the shelter air breathable, the temperature stable, the occupants alive. He began advising families on how to build their own shelters, applying his medical knowledge to the challenge of underground survival. Even Corbin Cobb changed. The young man who had thrown stones and shouted insults became one of Hollis's most reliable helpers. He never spoke about his transformation, never acknowledged the shame that must have driven it. But his actions spoke for him. Every family who wanted help rebuilding got it, and Corbin was always among the first to arrive. Shepherd Garrett found his purpose in the aftermath. "I want to build shelters," he told Wren and Hollis one evening as the sun set over a landscape slowly returning to life. "Not just here, everywhere. Every farm, every town, every place where people live under the sky." Wren looked at him with her father's journals in her hands. "Then we will teach you," she said, "everything he knew, everything he learned, everything he built." Over the next 15 years, Shepherd Garrett would keep that promise. He traveled across Kansas and into neighboring states, teaching families how to build their own underground refuges. By 1950, he had helped construct 47 shelters across 4 counties. Each one bore a small plaque near the entrance, in memory of Josiah Calloway, who taught us to prepare. A year passed, then 2, then 10. Wren grew from a girl of 15 into a woman of 25, and the years were kind to her. She became a teacher, like Constance Bellamy before her, but she taught more than reading and arithmetic. She taught survival, preparation, the wisdom her father had accumulated through decades of patient work. Hollis married a woman named Margaret, the daughter of Dr. Whitfield, who had come to respect the Callaways more than any family in the county. They had children of their own, 3 of them, who grew up playing in the shelter their grandfather had built. Learning its secrets, understanding its purpose, the shelter remained. It was maintained as Josiah Calloway had specified. Its water rotated, its supplies refreshed, its systems kept in working order. It became a landmark, a pilgrimage site, a reminder of what had been and what could be again. Bandit lived to be 14 years old, an extraordinary age for a working dog. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1942, surrounded by the family he had protected for so many years. They buried him beneath a cottonwood tree where he used to sit and watch the sky, and the headstone they carved bore simple words, "The Faithful One." And when Wren was 65 years old, her hair gray, her hands marked with age, she stood at the edge of the trap door with her grandchildren beside her. One of them, a boy of 7 named Josiah for his great-great-grandfather, looked up at her with curious eyes. "Grandma," he asked, "why did your father build this place?" Wren smiled. She thought of her parents, gone now for 50 years. She thought of the storm, remembered still by those who had survived it. She thought of Bandit, buried beneath the cottonwood tree. She thought of Shepherd, now an old man himself, still building shelters across the plains. She thought of all the lives saved, all the lessons learned, all the shelters built across Kansas and beyond. "Your great-great-grandfather knew something that most people forget," she said. She took the boy's hand in hers and led him down the stairs, into the cool silence of the underground chamber. He knew that the sky can become an enemy, that the earth can rise against us, that the only safety sometimes is in going deep. They stood together in the lamplight, surrounded by the careful evidence of her father's life work. The same stone walls, the same careful construction, the same promise of survival that had saved 30 lives half a century ago. But more than that, Wren continued, he knew that fear is not the opposite of love. Fear made him prepare. Love made him share. He built this place not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to protect everyone. Even the people who laughed at him, even the people who called him mad. She looked around the shelter, unchanged after all these years. "That is the secret beneath the earth," she said softly. "Not fear, love. Love that builds. Love that prepares. Love that outlasts everything, even death." The boy was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked up at her with eyes that reminded her of her father. "I want to learn," he said. "I want to know everything about this place. I want to be ready, like he was ready." Wren squeezed his hand. She felt the circle closing, the legacy continuing, the promise being kept. "Then I will teach you," she said. "Everything he knew, everything I learned, everything we have built together. They climbed the stairs together, into the light of a new day. The sky above was blue and clear, the wind gentle, the world at peace. But beneath the barn, the shelter waited, ready, patient, eternal, a gift from the dead to the living, a promise from the past to the future, a secret that was never really a secret at all. Just love, made solid, made lasting, made ready for whatever might come. This is the end of our story, but not the end of its lesson. Remember, the people who are laughed at today may be the ones who save us tomorrow. The work that seems pointless may be the work that matters most. And love, true love, is not just a feeling. It is action. It is preparation. It is building something that will outlast your own breath, for the sake of those you may never even meet. This is the secret beneath the earth. This is the gift of Josiah Calloway. This is the story of the Burrow children who saved a town. And it is a story that somewhere out there is still being written. The end.